everyone. Welcome to Eye on Arts. I'm Paul Aho, Interim Director of the Paducah School of Art, and I'm here with John Hasegawa today in the Clemens Fine Arts Center Gallery at West Kentucky Community and Technical College. What we'd like to do today is to introduce you to an exhibition that the school has hosted recently called the Paducah National Ceramics Invitational, a show exhibition organized by John Hasegawa and the school's former director, Harvey Sadow, some months ago. And we're hosting that here in the Clemens Gallery for the first time. And we're pleased to have the opportunity to show you some spectacular works of art made in ceramics. So what we're going to do is we're going to just have a little talk about each one of these various artists. We have 10 artists who are in the mix, and we're going to introduce their work to you, talk a bit perhaps about who they are, where they live, where they work, the sort of things that they do with clay that makes their work extraordinary. And I think that we'll all agree at the end of our half an hour that what we have here is a very extraordinary exhibition of creative works done with ceramics. So why don't we have a look around?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, let's have a look around. So what should we start with?
I think we should start with these pieces right over here, Paul.
With Craig Rhodes or with Harris Dellers?
With Craig. Let's start with Craig.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, so as we promised, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the work of individual artists, and John's going to talk a bit, as the resident expert on ceramic artwork, about perhaps how the works were built, who had a hand in building them, and some of the technical aspects that might make them more meaningful for our viewers. So John, what do we have to say about the work here of our friend Craig Rhodes?
Well, Craig Rhodes, he's a local potter. He's from Brookport. And you can see he's quite accomplished. I had the pleasure of throwing with him just a few days ago. And he's just an excellent potter. He has great hands. He throws the clay so beautifully. And so we wanted to bring him here for this show. And this is a piece of his that he calls a stoneware urn. And a stoneware is a type of clay that has a lot of kind of rough particles in it. And it fires very beautifully. So you can see the color is a nice kind of buff color here. And Craig has thrown this in multiple pieces because it's very difficult to throw a jar like this, this tall in one piece of clay. So I know from examining this very closely that this was probably thrown separately down here, and then he has joined it, another cylinder here and a cylinder up here, and then he threw this piece separately upside down.
So he would throw this section upside down as well?
Probably, and then attach it later.
Oh, that's remarkable.
Yeah. And then he's just such an excellent craftsman. You see how well that lid fits together, and his forms are just really beautiful. And then he does so much work with his glazing. He has all these different color of glazes and this great geometric pattern that you see coming across the surface, and I think it works really well with his form. And then he's really kind of accented it with these lines here to kind of frame the color. And there's this great proportion here between the different pieces.
Yeah, it's really an elegant shape. Yeah, really beautiful shape. It's amazing that he could throw that and get the outer dimensions to be so perfectly aligned. Yeah. And
you know, there's some risk, right, of it cracking when you join pieces of clay like this. There is some risk of it cracking where you join it. So it just takes a really diligent craftsman to make sure that the piece looks really cohesive, because you're really bringing different parts together that you've made separately and you're bonding them together. It has to look like a unified piece when you're done. And then he's also glazed the inside in this beautiful matte black glaze that's very similar to the glaze that he used on the outside.
And it's completely finished.
Oh yeah, it's completely finished. This beautiful piece on the inside. And it just has a great height and just a great presence. So this scale really is just such an attention grabber. Really kind of helps draw you in. And then he's just so perfect in laying out this pattern. It's just very geometric, but at the same time it has this beautiful flow, right? Because it's built around these squares, but he's changed the size of those squares as he's come down. And then at the corners he's put these different colors. And through that patterning he develops this kind of also this, there's so much geometry, but at the same time it develops this natural flow, diagonal flow. And so the pattern is rigid, but at the same time, it creates a lot of movement across the surface. It's very nice.
As a painted surface, it's remarkable, right? The way this sort of interval gets broader and it spirals and gets narrower again as it moves around that form.
Yeah, and you can see he continues it down here. So all the pieces through that strong pattern, he's also helping tie each one of these separate elements together: the top, the body, and then the thrown foot. Very
so
nice
they call
piece.
this the foot, right?
Yes, and so, you know, it almost looks like a pedestal or something where you can almost like lift this separate section off, right? So the way he's undercut it here, it really makes it almost look like an egg or something sitting in a stand at the breakfast table, a hard-boiled egg. That's the way it seems to me, right? And so he's really done that as on purpose, right, to really make these forms look very distinct from each other. But you also see here that he's repeated that curve here, similar to the curvature he has up here. So it's another thing that helps tie this form together. It's just really nice. And then the proportion between how tall this piece is here is kind of tying back into how the proportion of the height here. Just really well designed.
And this is a vessel shape that he uses fairly often.
Oh yes,
right?
he loves these longer, tall pieces. I think partially it's just he just wants a beautiful, pristine, long surface to glaze, to show off his glazing, because his glazing is just so beautiful, so controlled, and he just really helps propel the piece forward.
A lot of these artists talk about ornamentation in the same sentence as they talk about the vocabulary of form and the things that John has been talking about in terms of proportions and the relationship of this convex form to this concave form, right?
Yeah, and so he's taken this form, which is classical, but kind of modernize it, make it very contemporary by adding this more geometric pattern across the surface. Because this is not something you would see in a museum of ancient pottery, but the overall form is. But because he's decorated in this way, he's really brought it into like the 21st century.
Okay, well here we are with a couple of works by a gentleman by the name of Matt Long. And we're going to spend a minute talking about Matt's work, but I wanted to just ask John, because you mentioned a term before that many of our viewers might not understand, this notion of throwing vessels, and what exactly does that mean? Most of us have heard of potter's wheels, and we know that ceramic artists work with potter's wheels, but tell us a bit about the throwing process.
Well, throwing is where you take a ball of clay and you throw it down onto the pottery wheel, and then that pottery wheel, you set that pottery wheel in motion, spinning, and then you use that spinning motion plus applying force with your hands to help shape the clay into a form. Right, and you can throw a variety of forms. You can throw bowl shapes, or mugs, which are really traditional shapes. Or a lot of these artists are doing more complicated shapes, like Craig Rhodes, who we just talked about, or like Matt Long here, who's doing these different sorts of vessels. So he also does cups and other forms, but here he is very famous for doing his jugs and bottles. And so he does a lot of objects like whiskey bottles, like this one here. And so these are very interesting shapes, right? So one is very bulbous, the other one's very straight. And what's most noticeable about these two, in my opinion, is that he threw this shape on the wheel, and then what he does is he puts slip on the clay after he makes a shape. And slip is a lot like frosting in consistency, and what slip really is clay that's been watered down, so it's kind of goopy and pasty like frosting. And he puts it on the surface, a big thick coat, and then he takes something that's very similar to a rubber spatula and scrapes through the slip to create, and then the slip kind of folds down like frosting like this.
So gravity acts on that form, right?
Gravity acts on it. And so you can take a thrown object, which is usually pretty rigid and tight, and the form is really beautiful, and kind of helps loosen that surface up and create movement across that surface. So this line that he creates here across that surface is very beautiful here. And also, he uses a process called soda firing. And a soda firing is a type of kiln. He puts the pots in the kiln. The kiln gets fired up to a temperature about 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the end of the firing, when it reaches that temperature, they introduce basically soda, something similar to baking soda. And you throw that into the kiln, and it will decorate your pot. That soda vaporizes, and then that soda atmosphere affects the glazes on the pot. So you can see this is probably one glaze that's on here. And you can see from that one glaze on this pot, he's able to create this very nice variegated surface.
And the same is true, of
Same
course,
thing on that one,
with what's going on here, right? And the various colorations involved, just through the act of heat releasing chemicals.
And then it bonds, a lot of that soda will land on the pot and actually bond with the clay and act like a glaze or affect the glazed surface. And he's just the craftsmanship on these are beautiful. This fits on there really nicely. So this is actually a usable watertight jug, right?
And he talks a lot about the fact that he likes this notion of creating utilitarian objects and the sort of bond that we have with objects and how they actually shape our lives, right?
He wants these to be used like in this. I mean, they look great here in the gallery setting, but he really wants this on your tabletop, right? You're to be serving and drinking out of these objects. He's just really, really good.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Okay, thanks, Sean.
Yeah. Should we go look at Matt Wilt's pieces?
Let's do that. Okay, and we're here with the work of another artist, a gentleman who teaches at SIU in Evansville. His name is Matt Wilt. And if we look at this, we see that it's considerably different than the things we've seen so far, in that it's work by an artist who chooses not to work with traditional ceramic forms, but uses clay as a sculptural medium in combination with other types of materials. Is this common practice among ceramic artists, John?
It depends on what type of artist. Just like all the other arts, are people that are more traditional, and there are people that are really pushing the boundaries of the art form. And so Matt Wilt is one of those artists. And so we wanted to invite at least one non-traditional artist, someone that was really exploring the boundaries of what ceramic art is. So Matt has a combination of concrete and metal and glass.
And found objects, right?
Yes, and found objects, right? And so he basically, for him, anything goes, whatever can propel his message and his art forward, right? And so he's very lucky that he has a university that can support his artwork, because you need separate facilities to be able to do all this. Not just a ceramics lab, but it's good to have a metal smithing studio, you know, next door that you can have access to. And so there's just a lot of cool stuff here. Like this interesting piece here. This comes off. So there's a lot of separate components that go into making this piece. This head is separate from this. This is a piece of glass he says he gets on eBay. And so he needs to order all these parts, and all these separate pieces then need to come together to make one cohesive artwork.
And I think part of the content has to do with mechanization of, like what other things that we would consider generally humanistic aspects of our existence, right?
Yes, right. And so, you know, there's definitely other messages going on here. There's a great amount of texture going up here. This is the ceramic component. This is a ceramic piece here.
This is made out of clay?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then these components, I think that's clay, and I think that might be metal down there. But the tricky part is you can make the clay look like almost anything. So some pieces are very hard. It's very difficult to tell that they're made out of clay unless you come up and you touch them and you handle them. Right? And so it's pretty interesting. And so this piece, he had to come to the gallery, and he has 3 pieces in this show. It took him probably an hour and 40 minutes to assemble the pieces, because there's so many different components, all have to be put together. And so he likes to set up his own pieces himself because of that. It's just like if he had to write out the directions for the assemblage, it would just take too long. It would be just like 20-page document. So he's just an excellent artist. I really appreciate that he wanted to be part of this show.
Interesting work. Okay. All right, well, we're back, and we're looking at a collection of works by a number of different artists. We've got Sam Chung in the front, we've got Bonnie Seaman, this sort of exotic teapot in the middle, and we've got works by Thomas Hoadley off to the side, and a small bowl or plate-like device by a regional artist whose name is Wayne Bates. So, John, if we look at these, some of these things don't look like they're wheel thrown. They look like they're built with other means.
Yeah, so Tom and Sam both are slab builders, so they take a clay and they use a rolling pin and they kind of flatten it out into a sheet of clay, and so it's kind of like a board then, and they use that flat sheet of clay to construct their pieces. Bonnie Seaman, I'm not sure, she could be throwing or she could be hand building, and hand building just means that you're forming the clay without the wheel. Basically, it's every other process of clay forming without the wheel. So she could be coiling, which is laying coiling and constructing it slowly upward, or pinching. There could be a variety of techniques that she's using. And then Wayne, he's using the potter's wheel, right? So.
Well, and both of these forms look like they're articulated with some sort of carving practice, right?
So Wayne is using a process called sgraffito. And sgraffito is where you take, usually for him, he has a white clay body, so he throws that dish out of white clay, and then he takes different colored slips. Remember, we're talking about colored slips, and he is painting those different colors onto that white clay body, and then taking a tool and carving out his pattern on there. So on here, you can see this is, he puts a couple different colors on, and then so that's solid color at first, and then he takes a tool and he carves these lines through that color to reveal the white clay underneath. And so this is a process where you can get a very exacting design on your piece, because you see how you just get a really sharp and crisp line on there. And a lot of the Native American pottery pieces are done using this technique. Very nice little plate. Also, the way he makes it, it's very usable. Like, this is something that you could eat food out of, and it just makes a great presentation piece.
And then this piece by Tom Hoadley, or all the works by Tom, are distinct in that the coloration isn't a patina or a glaze of any sort at all, right?
No, he uses colored clay. So what he's doing is, these are actually, this isn't painted on there, this is actually colored clay. So this pattern goes all the way through from one side to the other. It's the same pattern. So this decoration goes all the way through. And so he builds up these different pieces of colored clay, puts them all together into a slab like this.
And then he forms the slab into a sculptural form, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Then he's just a master at doing this. And so you can see that he has these different patterns, has a streaking pattern, he has this beautiful like fingerprint zebra pattern going on right there, just gorgeous. So then he's adding some gold foil onto there.
So does he create that like as a body of clay and then slice that into?
That's one way of doing it, but this is done so beautifully. I think that's the way I would do it, but he is such a master, I'm not sure, right? Once again, he does it so well, it almost looks like it was made this way, by the hand of God almost. It's just so beautiful.
Well,
yeah.
And this little piece by Bonnie Seaman, who teaches at Florida Atlantic University in South Florida, is very different than much of the rest in its sort of whimsical quality. Right?
And it's heavily decorated. There's almost no place where there's no place with smooth texture. And this lid, she does the inside of the lid, even the inside of the lid has this textural pattern. She also is incorporating glass elements. These bugs are made out of glass. It's just really nice. And then you can see the lid just fits perfectly on there. So beautiful. And so she references vegetables and natural elements like that. So this is kind of like a leaf-like pattern. This kind of reminds me of a pomegranate going on there.
And then Sam Chung is sort of a pop art geometricist of some sort, right?
Yeah, and I think one of his parents was a tailor. So he takes the slabs of clay, and he actually, before he starts building his pots, he makes a paper model of it, and then cuts that paper model apart into the different pieces, like the way a dressmaker would.
Like a pattern, right?
Yeah, and then he takes those pieces and cuts those exact same pieces out of clay, and then reassembles his teapot back together again. So his forms are remarkably complicated, but once you really begin to study them, you begin to realize that each one of these shapes that he makes could have been made out of just separate flat pieces of clay that he's bent into the shape. Then he has used China paint to kind of develop these colors on his surface. And the China paint is very similar to a glaze, except it fires to a much lower temperature. Very good. He's a really great artist.
Yeah, remarkable
I love
piece.
his work.
Okay, and now we're going to spend a few moments talking about the work of Harris Deller, who's a professor at SIU over in Illinois. And what we're looking at looks more like sculpture than traditional vessel art.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's almost like a painted surface as well, right?
Yeah, and Harris is a really well-respected, pretty well-known ceramic artist. So he's right here near Paducah, just up the road at SIU Carbondale. So he is working with, once again, he's working with slabs again. So he's taking 2 flat sheets of clay and just putting together like this and then standing them on end. And that provides him with an excellent surface, basically, to be able to decorate these pieces and come up with these beautiful geometric patterns. And so we'll turn like this piece around. You can see that he has done both sides of these pieces. And you can see that his spatial composition across that surface is so great. And he has these really nice parallel lines that kind of swing around. And the way he has laid this pattern out, the eye is just naturally kind of connected between these different patterns. It's just a great, these are just great
And
pieces.
this surface is actually physical, so...
Yes,
right.
He carves into them, and this is what we call inlay. So inlay is where it's kind of the opposite of the sgraffito, where you're carving the color away. This time he's carving a groove in, and then putting the dark color into the groove. Right?
Sort of like an etching. Right?
Yeah, kind of like an etching, and they call it inlay, and then he cleans up the high points of the surface, right? And so, and he has a great line quality coming across here. And to me, it always looks like almost like a fingerprint, the way how he comes up with these patterns. And this just takes a really strong sense of design to create a pattern that is so simple, yet so powerful, and create a piece that's so strong. And even how he creates this overall form, how it gets wider down here, comes back up, comes around. It's just so beautiful.
And I love how the insides are black, right? And articulate the shape of that opening.
Yeah,
right?
it's really nice.
So do I dare to do this?
Sure.
Yeah.
They're very well made pieces.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Right now, this kind of comes around. If you look at this one, how this pattern is even linked to the other side, right? So he continues that geometry to the other side along this piece. Right, just really awesome.
Beautiful forms.
Yeah, I love them.
Okay, well here we are with a couple of pieces by Bede Clark. And John, these look considerably different than the things we were just looking at, both in terms of their forms and their surfaces.
Yeah. So this is a completely different type of firing process. This is what they call wood fire. And so what you do is traditionally, long time ago, before they had modern electricity and modern fuels such as gas or oil, all the kilns had to be fired with natural substances. Like, for example, wood was a predominant fuel for kilns. So, and a kiln is just basically where you put your pots in order to fire the clay. And so these are what some artists really like, the process, the more primitive process of wood fire. And so you put these pieces in the kiln. They could be glazed or unglazed when they go in. But as you burn the wood in the front of the kiln, some of the ash flies up and lands onto the pottery inside the kiln. And then if you get the kiln hot enough, that ash will turn into a glaze and melt onto the surface of the pot. So you can see this pot here has kind of one side is different than the other, right? And that what has happened is that as the wood ash flies, it kind of flies up over the pot, and then some of it will deposit on this side of the vessel. And then as the pot gets hot enough, then that ash then will turn into this beautiful glaze here.
And do you try to control the circulation of heat inside of the kiln?
Oh yeah, so it has a lot to do with the velocity of the flame, and then how the flame and the heat kind of pushes up and around and down through the pottery at the same time. And for example, you can see this pot here is nice large. You can see that you can kind of see this speckling is kind of where it's only a little bit of ash landed, but you can see there was a lot of ash that landed on the shoulder up here and kind of turned this this beautiful gray color here. And so these kilns are usually what they would call like a Japanese style, like an anagama kiln, which is kind of like this giant tube that goes up the side of a hill and then has a firebox that's like a little furnace up in front that's connected, and it just gets everything nice, beautiful, and hot. It's just a great experience. And It could take up to like 7 days to fire one of these pots.
So somebody has to keep stoking that kiln.
Yeah,
right?
for 24 hours a day for 7 days. But the result is just absolutely gorgeous. And a lot of times these kilns are big enough that a whole community of potters, like 5 or 6 potters, will all get together and put all their pots in together and make it more of a communal effort.
And is this a regional practice in America? Does that take place in certain areas more prevalently than others?
Well, it can't happen in the city, so it's usually outside the cities, but the prevalence of wood kilns in the United States has really grown over the past 10 or 15 years. It's a very nice piece. These are just awesome. And you can see how some of the ash becomes really runny. You can see the ash is running down the side of the vessel here.
And even a plain form like this has some surface decorations that he's gone to. Well, this is like a stamp of some sort into the wet clay, is that right?
Yeah, so it's probably a paddle that has a grid pattern carved into it. And so he's probably held his hand while this pot was, he just formed it brand new on the wheel. He's probably put his hand on the inside and then taken this paddle that had the grid pattern and probably just smacked it against there. And that's made this kind of raised pattern that's really nice here. And you see he's kind of done it 3 or 4 times, and that kind of creates a visual rhythm.
Yeah, it's a rhythmic thing.
Yeah, and so if I were the potter and I was doing this, so you can always see at least 2 or 3 of these designs as you're going around the pot. Right, and then he's put like this handle reference here. And traditionally, a handle like this, they could have strung a little line through a rope so they could hang it and suspend it from the ceiling.
Excellent. They're beautiful.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. We've had a good time taking you on a short tour around the Paducah School of Art's first National Ceramics Invitational. Thank you, John, for enlightening us. And again, all I can say is it's a marvel that you guys can do this with a material as slippery and malleable as clay, right? It's fantastic work. As we close, again, I would just like to remind everybody that the Paducah School of Arts provides training in ceramic and other art forms, and that the Clemens Gallery provides a regular resource of high caliber exhibitions like the ones that we're seeing here today on a regular basis, serving the college and the surrounding community. So it's our pleasure to bring this to you from West Kentucky Community and Technical College, and thank you all for being here today.